Hi, everyone. Quick one for you. Make sure you subscribe and like before we start. Thank you. I watched her carefully from across the dinner table. The soft clinking of silverware against porcelain was the only sound that filled the room. She smiled at me, the same rehearsed smile she'd been giving me for years. It was flawless, serene, almost too perfect. If I hadn't known better, I might have smiled back, lulled into the false security of a normal evening. But I did know better, and I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me smile. I had practiced this, preparing for this moment in my head over and over. Keep calm, keep steady. I wasn't ready for the reveal. Not yet. The time for confrontation was still on the horizon, and I wanted to savor every second leading up to it. She made small talk about her day, mentioning an office meeting, some project that was nearing completion, and a lunch with colleagues. The lies slipped off her tongue with ease, each one delivered as if they were no more than simple truths. A part of me marveled at how convincing she was, how expertly she had woven this alternate reality where she was still the faithful, loving wife. But I could see the cracks. They were small now, almost invisible, but they were there, and I was ready to pull them wide open. I cut into my steak, focusing on the way the knife sliced through the meat, anything to keep my hands busy. My pulse remained steady, my face impassive. She didn't deserve an emotional reaction. That would come later, when I had orchestrated her downfall to perfection. For now, I played along, the good husband, the clueless fool. Her phone buzzed on the table, and I caught the faintest flicker of panic in her eyes before she masked it with a quick smile. "It's nothing," she said, sliding the phone into her lap as if I hadn't seen it. "Just work." Work. Right. I took a sip of my wine, studying her as she continued with her meal, her movements careful, deliberate. She was nervous tonight. I could see it in the way her fingers fidgeted with her fork, in the way her eyes darted to the side as if she was waiting for something to happen. Did she sense it? The shift in the air, the subtle tension in the room that I knew was building. Did she suspect I knew? No, she didn't. I was too good at this. Too calm, too controlled. If she had even an inkling of what I had discovered, she would be crumbling by now. But she wasn't. Not yet. I had found out weeks ago. The first message had been a mistake, an errant text that wasn't meant for me but landed in my hands anyway. I had laughed at first, dismissing it as a joke, something silly from a friend. But the second message had left no room for laughter. It had shattered any illusion I had left. And now, as I watched her across the table, I felt that familiar knot of anger twist in my chest. But I kept it buried. Tonight was not about rage, it was about patience. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice light, casual. She still thought she was safe. "It was good," I replied evenly. "Busy, but good." She nodded, taking a small sip from her wine glass, her eyes briefly meeting mine before darting away again. She was nervous. Good, she should be. My revenge would come slowly, piece by piece, until she was so entangled in the consequences of her lies that there would be no escape. I imagined telling her now, watching the shock wash over her face, the way her carefully constructed life would crumble in an instant. But that wasn't how this needed to go. It would be too quick, too simple. She deserved more. She deserved to feel every ounce of discomfort and confusion that she had caused me. I raised my glass, meeting her eyes. "To us," I said with a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. Her hand hesitated before raising her own glass. "To us," she echoed, her voice softer now, uncertain. I watched her over the rim of my glass, already savoring what was to come. She had no idea what was waiting for her, how far I was willing to go. But I did, and I knew exactly how this was going to end. As I set my glass down, I could feel the shift in the air. The game had begun, and I was ready. When we first met, everything felt like it clicked into place, as if the world had been holding its breath until we found each other. I remember how easy it was to fall in love with her. Shell, with her sharp wit and a laugh that seemed to echo through a room long after she'd stopped. She was intoxicating, a combination of beauty and brains that I couldn't resist. I thought I was lucky, blessed even. Looking back now, it's almost embarrassing how naive I was, how blind I allowed myself to become. We met in a crowded bar after work one evening. It was one of those unremarkable places I'd usually walk past without a second thought. But that night, something drew me in. Maybe fate, maybe just dumb luck. Shell had been sitting with friends, casually sipping on a cocktail, laughing in a way that made everyone around her lean in. The kind of person who lights up a room effortlessly. I was pulled in like everyone else. I knew I had to speak to her. And when I did, everything felt easy. Too easy in hindsight. Our relationship blossomed quickly. Dates turned into weekends away, which soon led to us practically living together. There were no red flags, no warning signs back then. Or if there were, I was too caught up to see them. We were both driven, both had careers we were proud of, and everything seemed to be falling into place perfectly. She worked in marketing, effortlessly navigating the corporate world with charm and competence. I admired her for that. When we got married, friends and family looked at us as the golden couple, the ones who had it all figured out. I believed that narrative. I believed we had a solid foundation. It was easy to believe because Shell was the kind of woman who made you want to believe. I'd come home after a long day at work, and she'd be there, warm, affectionate, asking me how my day was and genuinely listening. It was such a simple thing, but it grounded me. I thought it grounded us. But looking back, I see the small cracks, the moments that should have made me pause. The late nights at the office. At first, I didn't think much of them. Shell was a career-driven woman, just like me. Her ambition had always been one of the things I loved about her. But gradually, the frequency of those late nights increased. Big projects, she'd say, her smile disarming me. We've got a lot on our plate right now. You know how it is. And I did know how it was, or at least I thought I did. I thought she was like me, that she found purpose in her work and occasionally got swept up in it. So I didn't question her. Why would I? I trusted her, and trust, as they say, is the foundation of any good marriage. Except I was building mine on sand. There were other small things too. A phone call she'd take in another room, her voice hushed, telling me it was a client, or the way she'd sometimes seem distant when we were together, her eyes unfocused as though her mind was a million miles away. I rationalized it all, told myself that relationships go through phases, that work stress was normal, that maybe I wasn't paying enough attention. I took the blame for the distance growing between us, and I tried harder, convinced that if I just put in more effort, we'd get back to what we were. But we never did. I still remember the first time I felt a real, tangible sense of something being wrong. It was a Saturday morning, and she was up earlier than usual, her phone clutched tightly in her hand as she moved around the kitchen. I glanced over at the screen and caught a glimpse of a name I didn't recognize. She quickly pulled the phone closer to her, her movements swift and practiced. When she saw me watching, she laughed it off, told me it was work, like she always did. But there was something different that day. Something in the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, in the way she avoided my gaze. It planted a seed of doubt, one that I tried to ignore for weeks afterward. I didn't want to be the paranoid husband, the one who second-guesses everything. But that seed grew quietly, steadily, until it was impossible to ignore. Still, I didn't confront her. Instead, I convinced myself that it was all in my head. We were both just busy, that's all. But the cracks were getting wider. She started spending more time on her phone, her laughter a little too high-pitched when she was texting late into the night. There was a new perfume, one she'd never worn for me, and clothes I hadn't seen her buy. Our weekends together became less frequent. She'd make excuses, telling me she had to work, or that she was meeting a friend for lunch. She'd leave early and come back late, her explanations increasingly flimsy. But still, I said nothing. I watched. I waited. There was a time when I'd have given anything to be wrong, to find out that all of this was just my mind playing tricks on me. But that hope died the day I received that text message. I can still remember the way my chest tightened when I read it. A message meant for her, but delivered to me by mistake. I stared at the words on my phone, my vision blurring slightly as I processed what they meant. You were hot and sweet today, baby. Can't wait for tomorrow. It was like a punch to the gut. All the things I'd been trying so hard to ignore, to rationalize, came crashing down at once. The weight of it was unbearable, but I didn't let it show. I didn't scream, didn't throw my phone across the room like I might have in another life. Instead, I sat there in silence, letting the shock wash over me. I don't know how long I stayed that way, but eventually the numbness faded, replaced by something colder, a determination that I hadn't felt before. I didn't confront her that night. Instead, I decided to collect more evidence to confirm what I already knew deep down. Over the next few weeks, I paid closer attention. I went through her phone while she was in the shower, found the hidden text, the messages exchanged between her and her lover. It was all there, plain as day. She wasn't even careful. I felt like a fool. But more than that, I felt something inside me shift. I wasn't going to be a fool anymore. I wasn't going to let this break me. If anything, I was going to break her. And I knew exactly how I'd do it. In the days that followed, I played my part to perfection. I acted as though nothing had changed, smiled when she came home late, pretended I didn't notice when she slipped away to take a phone call outside. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. My mind was racing, calculating my next move, crafting a plan that would leave her with nothing. I realized as I watched her lie so easily, so fluidly, that she wasn't the only one who could play this game. Only I would play it better. The message hit me harder than I expected. I stared at my phone screen, the words burning into my mind. You were hot and sweet today, baby. Can't wait for tomorrow. It was meant for her, not me. I remember the exact moment. The sunlight filtering through the blinds, the quiet hum of the house in the background. I should have felt more rage, shock, something, but instead, a numbness settled over me. My first instinct was to deny it, to believe it was some kind of sick joke. But deep down, I knew better. The next message followed, seconds later, the confirmation I didn't want. Are you using Shell's phone? Make sure to delete this. That cuckold shouldn't suspect too soon. My world cracked open in that moment. The reality I'd been living, the trust I thought I had in her, all of it shattered. But I didn't react, not outwardly. I felt my heart rate slow instead of quicken, my breath steady rather than race. Something inside me had shifted. I stared at the phone, replaying the words in my head over and over until they no longer meant anything. Then I set the phone down and stood up. I needed air. I stepped outside into the backyard and breathed in the fresh, crisp air. Everything around me looked the same. The trees, the neatly trimmed grass, the sound of distant traffic. But nothing felt the same. My mind buzzed with an odd, eerie clarity. I wasn't going to confront her, not yet. What good would that do? An angry outburst, a few tears, a fight. It would all be over too soon. No, I needed to know more. I needed to be sure. I returned to the house and found her in the living room, casually flipping through her laptop, completely unaware of what had just unfolded. I stood there for a moment watching her. She looked up and smiled at me, her face relaxed, eyes twinkling as if nothing was wrong. I felt the numbness spread, cold and steady. I returned her smile, forcing my lips into a shape they didn't want to take. Everything okay? She asked. Yeah, I said, keeping my voice calm. Just got some work stuff to deal with later. She nodded, satisfied with the response, and turned her attention back to the screen. It was surreal, watching her like this, so innocent in her deceit. I moved to the kitchen, my mind already working through the next steps. I didn't check her phone that night. There was no need. The messages told me everything I needed to know. Shell had made the first fatal mistake, and now it was my turn. Instead of confronting her, I spent the next few days doing what I did best, observing, planning, preparing. Every action I took was deliberate, every word calculated. I listened more closely to her conversations, paid attention to her movements, and analyzed her behavior in a way I never had before. Each day brought new revelations. Shell was careful, but not careful enough. There were moments, small ones, where she let her guard down. A sly text she thought I wouldn't see, An unexplained late night at the office. A phone call she took in the other room. She had become too comfortable in her deception, too confident that I was oblivious. I watched silently as the pieces began to fit together. She was good at hiding the affair, but not as good as she thought. I picked up on the inconsistencies, the little mistakes she made. I tracked her lies, every detail she offered about her day that didn't quite add up. It was like pulling on a thread, and with each tug, the fabric of her lies unraveled just a little more. Still, I didn't act. Not yet. It wasn't enough to catch her in the act. I needed to understand the full scope of her betrayal before I moved forward. One evening, when she was out meeting a friend, I accessed her laptop. It wasn't difficult. She'd left it on the kitchen counter, and her password was laughably predictable: our wedding anniversary. I navigated through her emails and texts, searching for more evidence. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. Emails, chat logs, explicit messages exchanged between her and the other man. Mark. Of course, it had to be Mark. He was one of her colleagues, someone she'd mentioned in passing a few times, but never in a way that seemed suspicious. I scrolled through their conversations, a wave of cold fury settling into my chest. The things they said to each other, the way she spoke to him, it was as if I didn't exist in her world anymore. She had a whole life with him, a secret relationship built on lies and deceit, and she had hidden it from me for months. It wasn't the affair itself that enraged me the most. It was the ease with which she had carried on, the nonchalance, the complete disregard for me and our life together. I had been nothing but an afterthought, the fool in the background while she played out her fantasy with Mark. I spent the next few days gathering more information, screenshotting everything, forwarding copies of emails to myself, creating a folder of evidence. This wasn't going to be a confrontation. It was going to be a reckoning. My next step was simple but necessary. I needed to establish control over the situation without her knowing. I started by gaining access to our shared bank accounts. Shell had always handled the finances, which I trusted her with. Now I began subtly shifting money out of joint accounts into a private one she wouldn't know about. I made sure the transfers were small enough not to raise suspicion, but steady enough to give me leverage when the time came. I also began changing the passwords to several of our online accounts, locking her out of things slowly, piece by piece. If she noticed, she didn't say anything, likely too distracted by her affair. I wanted her to feel safe, to feel like nothing had changed, while I carefully pulled the strings from behind the scenes. Next came the social manipulation. We had a tight-knit circle of friends, people we spent weekends with, people who admired our marriage. I started planting seeds of doubt in subtle ways, little comments here and there about Shell's erratic behavior, about her late nights at the office, about how she'd seemed distant lately. I never outright accused her of anything, but I could see the way our friends started looking at her differently, wondering if something was wrong. At the same time, I started distancing myself from her. I was careful not to make it too obvious, but I knew she could sense the shift. I didn't reach for her hand as often, didn't engage in the usual small talk we'd always shared. I could see her trying to gauge my mood, trying to figure out if I knew something, but I played my role perfectly, maintaining the illusion of the oblivious husband. It was around this time that I noticed a change in her. She seemed jumpier, more paranoid. I'd catch her checking her phone obsessively, her brow furrowed in thought. She'd ask me more often how my day was, as if trying to assess whether I was suspicious. I'd respond with vague, nonchalant answers, watching her carefully. One night, while we were watching TV, she leaned in close to me, her voice softer than usual. "Is everything okay with us?" she asked, her eyes searching mine for something, anything. I looked at her, keeping my expression neutral. "Why wouldn't it be?" I asked, my tone light, as though I had no idea what she was getting at. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I don't know, you've just seemed different lately." "I've just been busy," I lied. "Work's been hectic." She nodded, accepting the explanation for now, but I could see the doubt lingering behind her eyes. She knew something was wrong, but she didn't know what. It was perfect. I wasn't just waiting for her to slip up. I was creating the circumstances in which she would. Every move I made was calculated, designed to push her further into paranoia, to make her second guess herself. I wanted her to feel the walls closing in, to sense that something was coming, but not know when or how. The next step was ensuring she couldn't run when the time came. I made a few calls to our lawyer under the pretense of discussing estate planning. In reality, I was preparing for divorce proceedings. I gathered financial documents, made copies of our assets, and positioned myself to take the lion's share when it all came crashing down. If Shell thought she could walk away from this unscathed, she was wrong. When I was done with her, she'd have nothing left. But I wasn't in a rush. Revenge wasn't about speed, it was about precision, about making every step count. I wanted her to fall slowly, to feel the weight of every decision she'd made, and I was going to make sure she did. In the meantime, I continued to watch her unravel. Every day she became a little more frantic, a little more careless. She started drinking more at night, her phone glued to her hand, as if she expected it to betray her at any moment. I'd sit across from her, pretending not to notice, while inside I reveled in the chaos I was creating. Shell was unraveling, and I was pulling the thread. It began with the smallest of changes, just subtle enough that she wouldn't notice the shifts, but impactful enough to begin to destabilize the world she thought she controlled. Revenge, as I learned, is not about brute force or dramatic gestures. It's about eroding the foundation so slowly and quietly that by the time the cracks appear, the damage is already irreparable. Shell would never know what was happening until it was too late, and by then, there would be no escape. The first step was financial. Shell always handled our money with a meticulousness that had once impressed me. She was organized, careful, and always on top of every bill, every bank statement. But that diligence was also her weakness. She had grown so comfortable in her control of our finances that she never considered I would notice the small transactions I began making, moving money out of our joint accounts into a private one only I had access to. The amounts were small, subtle enough to fly under the radar of any monthly statement she glanced at, but they added up over time. It wasn't just about the money, it was about power. Slowly, I was cutting off her access to control, shifting the balance of our relationship. She believed she held the reins, but I had already started slipping them from her fingers, one subtle move at a time. Next came the psychological manipulation. I'd always been careful about what I said around her, but now I began to plant seeds of doubt. Nothing overt, nothing obvious, just small comments here and there, designed to make her question herself. "Did you forget to pay the phone bill again?" I asked one evening, knowing full well that she hadn't. Her brow furrowed slightly, that tiny flicker of doubt surfacing. "I thought I did," she muttered, confused, and then quickly brushed it off. "I'll check later." Little moments like that, repeated over days and weeks, began to add up. I watched as Shell's confidence began to waver, as she started second-guessing herself more frequently. It was subtle at first, misplacing her keys, forgetting a meeting, but slowly I could see the stress building in her. She was used to being in control, and now that control was slipping, though she couldn't quite figure out why. But I wasn't done. I started manipulating her calendar. Shell was incredibly detail-oriented, so when she thought she had an important client meeting one day, only to realize she had misread her own schedule, and it wasn't until the next week she was visibly frustrated. I pretended to sympathize, but inside I felt a rush of satisfaction. Her life was unraveling, and I was behind every thread. The next step was social. Shell had always prided herself on maintaining a wide circle of friends, people who admired her intelligence and charm. I began to work on that circle, carefully and methodically. It started with little comments during gatherings, casual observations about how busy Shell had been lately, how stressed she seemed. "She's been working late a lot, hasn't she?" I'd say to one of her friends at a dinner party. "I'm worried she's burning herself out." Concerned looks, quiet nods. They were buying into the narrative without realizing it. It was subtle, of course, never an accusation, just gentle prodding. Over time, I could see her friends start to distance themselves, unsure of what was going on with Shell, but unwilling to confront her directly. I knew Shell could sense the change in them, but she had no idea why. She began mentioning how disconnected she felt from her friends, how they were acting differently around her. I listened sympathetically, all while knowing I had engineered every bit of it. Meanwhile, I kept the facade of the loving husband, the supportive partner. I still played my part perfectly, asking her how her day was, making small talk over dinner. But I knew she could feel the shift in me too. I wasn't as present as I had been, not as affectionate. She was growing suspicious, I could tell, but she still hadn't connected the dots. She thought it was all in her head, and I made sure she kept thinking that. The beauty of it all was that Shell had no idea she was being manipulated. She was too busy trying to hold together the facade of her life, too focused on keeping her affair with Mark a secret. I watched her juggle it all, her work, her social life, her secret relationship, while her grip on everything slowly slipped, and I didn't have to lift a finger. It was all falling apart on its own, just as I'd planned. The cracks in her carefully constructed world grew wider when I started making small adjustments to her social life. I knew Shell was looking forward to a work event, one that was crucial for her career. It was a networking opportunity that could lead to a major promotion. So I accidentally mentioned the wrong date to one of her colleagues, ensuring that she would miss the event entirely. Shell showed up a day late, humiliated when she realized her mistake. It was a small, seemingly innocent error, but the impact on her reputation was immediate. When she came home that evening, her face was pale, her hands trembling. "I don't know what happened," she muttered, sitting at the kitchen table. I swear I had the right date. I sat across from her, my expression full of concern. "You've just been under a lot of stress," I said softly, reaching across to take her hand. "It's okay. These things happen." But I could see the doubt gnawing at her. I had been chipping away at her confidence for weeks, and now she was beginning to unravel. It wasn't just her professional life that was falling apart. Her relationship with Mark was beginning to strain as well. I made sure of that. I had access to her phone now, something she didn't know. When she left it unattended, I would go through her messages, carefully editing them, deleting certain texts, sending others to stir the pot. I made sure Mark began to feel like something was off, like Shell was playing games with him. One afternoon, I sent a message to Mark from Shell's phone while she was in the shower. "I don't know if this is going to work out," I typed. "I've been thinking a lot, and I don't think I can keep doing this." I deleted the message from her phone so she had no idea it had been sent. When Mark responded, confused and angry, she was blindsided. I watched her scramble to figure out what had gone wrong, trying to reassure him that she hadn't sent any such message. But the damage was done. Mark's trust in her was shaken, and their secret relationship grew more tense by the day. Shell started becoming paranoid, checking her phone constantly, growing increasingly anxious. I could see the strain in her every time she picked up a message from Mark, trying to explain away the confusion. Their conversations became more hostile, and I reveled in the chaos I had created. She thought her life was spiraling out of control because of her own mistakes, her own carelessness. Little did she know, I was behind every move, every misstep. As her relationship with Mark frayed, so did her mental state. She began drinking more heavily at night, her eyes red and tired as she slumped on the couch. The once confident woman I had known was slipping away, replaced by someone desperate and frazzled. She tried to maintain the appearance of normalcy, but I could see the cracks widening. One night, after one too many glasses of wine, she looked at me, her eyes filled with exhaustion and uncertainty. "What's happening to me?" she whispered, her voice shaky. "I feel like I'm losing my mind." I looked at her, my expression carefully neutral. "You've just been under a lot of pressure," I said gently, as if I hadn't been the one orchestrating that pressure. "Maybe you need to take a break, step back from work for a while." She nodded, her eyes distant, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. She was lost, and I had made sure of it. The thrill of control was intoxicating. I watched as her life slowly fell apart around her, as she tried in vain to hold it all together. Every move I made pushed her further into isolation, into doubt, into paranoia, and yet she still hadn't figured it out. She still believed she was the one at fault, that she was somehow responsible for the chaos in her life. It was perfect issue. But I wasn't done. I started preparing for the final phase of my plan, public humiliation. Shell had always cared deeply about her reputation, her standing in our social circle. So I made sure that when her affair with Mark finally came to light, it would be in the most humiliating way possible. I began leaking small pieces of information to the right people, carefully curated snippets of conversations, vague suggestions of impropriety. I planted the seeds of gossip, knowing they would spread like wildfire. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. People began questioning Shell's behavior, her late nights, her erratic mood swings. The rumors grew, and I watched as Shell became more and more isolated. Her friends distanced themselves. Her colleagues started treating her with suspicion. She was spiraling, and I was the only one who knew why. As Shell's world collapsed around her, I remained calm, composed. I had orchestrated every move, every downfall, and now all I had to do was wait. The end game was approaching, and when it came, Shell would have nothing left. No career, no friends, no lover. She would be alone, just as she deserved, and I would be free. The final phase of my plan required precision, patience, and a willingness to push boundaries I hadn't crossed before. Shell was already unraveling, but it wasn't enough for her life to fall apart in private. That wasn't true justice. She needed to lose everything: the respect of her colleagues, the trust of her friends, the carefully curated image of a successful, dedicated professional. I wanted her downfall to be public and inescapable, leaving no room for recovery. The manipulation had been working beautifully. Shell was missing deadlines at work. Her colleagues were beginning to doubt her reliability, and her friends had started keeping their distance. She was isolated, confused, and I could tell from the way she avoided eye contact at home that she felt something was wrong between us. But she couldn't put her finger on it. She was still holding on to the hope that I didn't know about her affair with Mark, still clinging to the belief that her lies were intact. It was time to tighten the noose. I started with her career. Shell was always proud of her work, her reputation as a competent, high-performing professional. That pride was a vulnerability, and I knew exactly how to exploit it. I began carefully feeding information to her superiors, anonymous tips about her performance, her missed meetings, her questionable behavior. I crafted the messages to seem concerned, as though a colleague or well-meaning acquaintance was worried about her recent change in demeanor. The beauty of it was that I didn't have to lie. Shell had already been slipping, thanks to the pressure I'd been putting on her. She'd missed key meetings, bungled a few important presentations, and had been late on several reports. My messages to her bosses simply highlighted those incidents, connecting the dots in a way that would force them to take notice. A few weeks later, Shell was called into a meeting with the senior partners of her firm. I didn't need to be there to know how it went. When she came home that evening, her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she set her bag down. I watched her from the kitchen, calmly slicing vegetables for dinner, pretending not to notice the tension radiating from her. "They called me into a meeting today," she said, her voice shaky. "Oh," I kept my tone light, neutral. "About what?" They said they've noticed a decline in my work. Missed deadlines, lack of focus. They're worried I'm not performing at the level I used to." She ran a hand through her hair, exhaling sharply. "I don't understand what's happening. I've been trying so hard, but everything keeps slipping." I nodded sympathetically, setting the knife down and turning to face her. "You've been under a lot of stress lately," I said, my voice soft, soothing. "Maybe you need to take a break, step back for a while." She looked at me, her eyes wide, desperate. "I can't take a break now. I can't let everything fall apart." I wanted to laugh at the irony of her words. Everything was falling apart, and it was by my design, but I didn't laugh. Instead, I stepped forward and pulled her into a hug, feeling her body sag against mine as if she needed something, anything to hold on to. "It'll be okay," I whispered, knowing full well that it wouldn't. The next stage was social. Shell had always thrived on her social connections, the dinner parties, the networking events, the friends who admired her ambition and charm. I needed to destroy that too. I had already begun planting seeds of doubt among her friends, but now it was time to escalate. It started at a friend's birthday party. We were at a fancy restaurant, seated at a large table with several of Shell's closest friends. She was trying her best to be her usual charismatic self, laughing and chatting, but I could see the cracks. She wasn't as confident as she used to be, and her laughter seemed forced, her eyes darting nervously around the room as though she expected something to go wrong at any moment. As the evening progressed, I leaned over to one of her closest friends, Emily, and casually said, "Shell's been really stressed lately. She hasn't been herself." Emily frowned, concerned. "I've noticed. Is everything okay?" I sighed, lowering my voice just enough to make it seem like I was reluctant to say anything. "I don't know. She's been so distant, and she's missed a few important things at work. I think it's all catching up to her." Emily nodded, her worry deepening. "I'll check in on her." And just like that, the doubt was spreading. By the end of the evening, several of Shell's friends had started whispering among themselves, exchanging glances whenever Shell spoke. She noticed it, of course. She could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the way her friends were treating her with a strange combination of sympathy and suspicion. It ate away at her, but I wasn't done. The final blow came a week later during one of her firm's biggest networking events of the year. Shell had been looking forward to it for months, believing it was her chance to redeem herself after the rough few weeks at work. What she didn't know was that I had already laid the groundwork for her public humiliation. I had managed to gain access to her work email, something she hadn't even noticed, and I'd been carefully planting false information, scheduling conflicts, and most importantly, setting up an anonymous tip to the firm's leadership about Shell's inappropriate relationship with Mark. I made sure the email looked like it had come from a concerned colleague, complete with screenshots of their text messages that I had carefully doctored to make it seem like Shell had been careless with her phone, leaving evidence of the affair for anyone to see. The night of the event, I watched from the sidelines as everything unraveled. Shell arrived at the venue in her best dress, her hair perfectly styled, ready to make a good impression. But as the evening went on, I could see the whispers starting, the way her colleagues and superiors were glancing at her, exchanging hushed conversations behind her back. It didn't take long for the rumors to reach her. She was pulled aside by one of the senior partners, who quietly informed her that they had received troubling information about her conduct. I watched as her face turned white, her hands trembling as she tried to defend herself, insisting that it was all a misunderstanding, but it was too late. The damage had been done. She was humiliated, her career in shambles, her reputation destroyed. I could see the devastation in her eyes as she realized there was no coming back from this. She left the event early, her head down, her steps hurried as she tried to escape the stares of her colleagues. I followed her home, staying just far enough behind to give her space, to let her wallow in the realization that everything she had built was crumbling around her. When I walked through the door, Shell was sitting at the kitchen table staring blankly at her phone. I could see the message thread open, the one between her and Mark. He had already texted her, angry and confused, asking why she hadn't been more careful, why their relationship was now the subject of office gossip. She looked up at me, her eyes hollow. "I've lost everything," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I walked over to her, standing just behind her chair, watching as she scrolled through the messages. "What happened?" I asked, my voice calm, measured. "They know," she said, her voice breaking. "Everyone knows." I let the silence hang between us for a moment before I spoke again, my tone carefully neutral. "Maybe it's time to come clean." She looked up at me, her expression filled with desperation. "Come clean about what?" I tilted my head slightly, my eyes locking with hers. "About everything. The affair, the lies, the way you've been hiding it all from me." For a moment, she didn't move. Her eyes widened in shock, her breath caught in her throat. And then slowly realization dawned on her. She understood. I watched as the color drained from her face, as the truth hit her like a freight train. You, you knew? She whispered, her voice shaking. I nodded, my expression calm. I've known for a long time. Tears welled up in her eyes as she tried to speak, her voice cracking. Why didn't you say anything? I took a step closer, leaning down so that my face was inches from hers. Because I wanted you to feel what it's like to lose control. To watch everything slip away piece by piece until there's nothing left. She stared at me, her tears now streaming down her cheeks, her hands trembling as she gripped the edges of the table. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I straightened up, looking down at her with a sense of satisfaction I hadn't expected. It's too late for that. For a moment, the silence between us was deafening. Shell's shoulders shook as she sobbed quietly, her world crumbling around her, and I felt nothing but cold, calculated victory. It was done. She had nothing left. No career, no friends, no lover. She was alone, broken, and the image of the strong, confident woman she had once been was shattered beyond repair. I turned and walked away, leaving her at the table, knowing that my revenge was complete. The dinner table was silent, just as it had been in the opening of this twisted game. But now the silence was thicker, laden with the weight of what was about to come. I watched her across the table, her hands slightly shaking as she held the wine glass, unaware that I was watching her world unravel, just as I had meticulously planned. Her eyes met mine, searching for a warmth that was no longer there, and for the briefest moment, I almost felt pity for her. But pity had no place here. Not anymore. I let the quiet hang between us for a little longer, savoring the anticipation of what was about to unfold. Her eyes darted from her glass to her phone as if expecting some last-minute salvation from whatever unknown tension she sensed. She was waiting for me to speak, but I made her wait, just like I had for the past months. I wanted her to feel every second of the unease, the dread that had been creeping into her life. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, too calm. You know, I began, setting my fork down deliberately, watching her closely as I leaned back in my chair. It's fascinating how people can lie so easily. Her body stiffened, the wine glass frozen halfway to her lips. I saw her connector, the confusion and panic rising behind her carefully composed exterior. Her expression hardened, but there was fear in her eyes. I don't know what you mean, she said, but her voice wavered, betraying her. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, my gaze never leaving hers. Oh, Shell, you really don't know? I asked, letting the words hang in the air like a noose tightening around her neck. Or are you just hoping I don't? She put the glass down, her hand trembling now. You're scaring me. What is this about? I gave a small, humorless smile. This is about trust, Shell. Trust in the lies that destroy it. She stared at me, her breath shallow now, her eyes wide. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone, swiping through the messages I had saved for this moment. I slid it across the table toward her. Her eyes flickered down to the screen. The color drained from her face as she read the messages. Those damning words from Mark, the ones I had kept hidden all this time. The truth laid bare, in a format she couldn't deny. She looked up at me, her mouth opening, but no words came out. I know everything, I said, my voice hardening now. The texts, the meetings, the lies. Shell's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. Don't, I cut her off. Don't insult me with more lies. I've had enough of that. The room was unbearably still as the reality of her situation sank in. I watched as the tears began to fall, but they meant nothing to me now. They were too little, too late. She crumbled, her sobs quiet at first, but then louder, her whole body shaking. I'm sorry, she choked out. I didn't mean for it to happen. I was stupid. Stupid, I repeated, leaning back in my chair again, watching her crumble. You were a lot of things, Shell, but stupid isn't one of them. You were careful. I'll give you that. You thought you could hide it forever. You thought I wouldn't notice. She looked up at me, mascara streaking down her face. I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't know how to stop. You didn't know how to stop? I interrupted, my voice rising for the first time. Or you didn't want to. You didn't want to stop because you enjoyed it. You thought you could have it all. Your marriage, your affair, your perfect life. I swear it didn't mean anything, she pleaded, her voice desperate now. I shook my head, a cold smile on my lips. But it did, Shell. It meant everything. It meant that you thought I was a fool. It meant that you didn't respect me enough to even be honest. It meant that you took everything we built, everything I trusted you with, and you spat on it. The silence that followed was deafening. She didn't speak. She couldn't. She just sat there, staring at me, as the full weight of her betrayal settled over her like a suffocating blanket. And now, I said, my voice steady and cold, you get to watch everything fall apart, just like I did. She opened her mouth, but I stopped her with a raised hand. No more apologies. They're meaningless now. For a long moment, we just sat there staring at each other. She was broken, defeated, and I had all the power. It was exactly what I had wanted, what I had planned. But as I looked at her, a part of me, a part I hadn't expected, felt empty. It was as if all the months of careful planning, the calculated destruction, had led to this hollow, anticlimactic moment. She was broken, just as I had intended, but the satisfaction I had expected didn't come. She sobbed quietly into her hands, her world crumbling around her, and I felt nothing. I'm leaving, I said finally, standing up and pushing the chair back. Her head snapped up, her tear-streaked face filled with shock and desperation. What? She whispered. I'm done, I said, grabbing my phone from the table. There's nothing left to say, nothing left to do. You're just leaving? She stammered, as if the thought of me walking away was somehow worse than the confrontation. I nodded. This is over. We're over. I could see the panic rising in her again. But we can fix this. We can. There's nothing to fix, Shell, I said, cutting her off. I already did. I fixed everything. She didn't understand, not fully, not yet. But she would. Soon she would see how carefully I had orchestrated everything, how I had dismantled her life piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the ruins of what she had destroyed with her own selfishness. And I wouldn't be here to watch it. I walked to the door, leaving her sobbing at the table. The finality of it all weighed on me, heavier than I had anticipated. As I opened the door, the cool night air hit me, and for the first time in months, I felt free. Free from the lies, the deceit, the constant calculations. But with that freedom came something else, something darker, more insidious, a creeping sense of loss. Not for Shell, not for the marriage we had once shared, but for the part of myself that I had buried in my quest for revenge. I stepped out into the night, pulling the door closed behind me with a soft click. The sound of Shell's sobs faded into the background as I walked down the street, each step feeling heavier than the last. I had won. I had destroyed her, just as I had set out to do. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something vital had been lost along the way. Revenge, it turned out, was not the balm I had hoped it would be. It didn't heal the wounds of betrayal. It didn't erase the pain or the humiliation. It just ended things. I stopped at the corner of the street, staring out at the quiet, empty road ahead of me. I had spent so long focused on tearing Shell's life apart that I hadn't considered what would come after. Now that it was over, there was nothing. Just an empty street stretching out before me with no clear direction. I had taken back control, but in doing so, I had lost something too, something I hadn't anticipated. And now, as I stood there, alone in the dark, I realized that I wasn't sure what to do next. There was no going back. Not to Shell, not to the life we had before. That life was dead, buried under the weight of lies and betrayal. And with it, a part of me had been buried too. I turned and walked away, the night swallowing me whole. I walked away from Shell that night, the door closing behind me with a soft click. Each step felt heavier than the last as I moved further from the life we had once shared, a life I had methodically dismantled. I had done it, executed my plan flawlessly, stripped her of everything she held dear. Her affair was exposed, her career in ruins, and her social circle dissolved. I had won. But as I turned the corner and disappeared into the night, that victory didn't taste as sweet as I thought it would. I kept walking, letting the cool air fill my lungs. Each step meant to take me further from the devastation I'd left behind. For months, I had focused on revenge with singular precision, and in those moments, everything else had faded away. My own emotions, my grief, my anger. But now, in the silence that followed, I was forced to confront what was left. The truth was, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel relieved. In fact, I felt hollow, empty. It was as if I had taken apart not just Shell's life, but my own. And now there was nothing left for either of us. I found myself standing at the edge of a small park, its quiet stillness matching the emptiness inside me. I sat down on a bench, staring out at the deserted path ahead, and for the first time, I allowed myself to reflect on what I had done. I had told myself that Shell's betrayal deserved justice, that her lies needed to be punished. But now that I had delivered that punishment, what had I really gained? I had imagined this moment many times. I had envisioned the satisfaction of watching her world crumble, of seeing her face when she realized I knew everything. And yes, there had been a rush of control, of power, in the revelation, in the way she had been blindsided by my manipulation. But now, as I sat here alone, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been lost in the process, something I hadn't anticipated. I had become a different man, one I didn't fully recognize. The man who once believed in trust, who thought he had a strong marriage, who cherished the life he and Shell had built, was gone. In his place was someone colder, more calculating, someone who had spent months orchestrating destruction instead of healing from betrayal. The realization hit me harder than I expected. I had spent so much time focused on making Shell pay that I hadn't stopped to consider what that would cost me. Revenge had consumed me, taken over every part of my life, and now that it was over, I wasn't sure what was left. Shell would survive this, I knew that. She would pick up the pieces, find a way to rebuild her life. She might never fully recover from the damage I had inflicted, but she would move forward. But what about me? Could I move forward from this? Could I ever go back to the person I was before? I wasn't sure anymore. As I sat in the quiet of the park, I realized that my victory had come at a personal cost, one I hadn't been prepared for. I had taken control of the situation, yes, but in doing so, I had lost control of something far more important, myself. I had let the betrayal define me, let it reshape my entire life into something dark, something vengeful. And now I wasn't sure if I could find my way back. I stood up from the bench, the weight of my actions pressing down on me. I had ruined Shell's life, but I had also destroyed parts of my own. The man I had been, the man who had loved her, trusted her, was gone. And the man I had become, well, I wasn't sure who he was anymore. The night stretched out before me, the path ahead uncertain. I had regained control of my life, but at what cost? The emotional scars of betrayal and revenge lingered, and I wasn't sure they would ever fully heal. I had thought that by making her suffer, I would feel whole again, but now I realized that revenge didn't fill the void. It only made it deeper. I began walking again, but this time there was no clear direction. I was just moving, putting distance between myself and the wreckage of my marriage. The future felt uncertain, shadowed by the choices I had made. I had won the game, but the victory felt hollow. There was no sense of closure, no sense of peace, just an endless stretch of questions about what I had sacrificed in the pursuit of vengeance. Would I ever be able to trust again? Could I find a way to rebuild my life after everything I had done? Or was I doomed to carry this emptiness with me, a reminder of the cost of revenge? I didn't have the answers. Not yet. All I knew was that the path ahead would be long, and I wasn't sure where it would lead. As I disappeared into the darkness, one thing became clear. Vengeance, no matter how perfectly executed, always comes at a price. And that price, I realize now, wasn't just Shell's downfall, it was the loss of the man I used to be. As the night swallowed me whole, I wondered if that was a price I had been truly willing to pay.